They said 1 million men could not take Tarawa in 100 years. 76 hours later, the shooting stopped. What happened in between was an experiment in modern amphibious war, reef, tide, and coral against steel tracks, naval guns, and hard lessons paid for in blood. This is the story of Besho, the tiny sliver of sand that taught the United States how to cross oceans and smash fortified islands, fast. The Boast and the map. Draw a crescent of coral in the central Pacific. The Gilbert Islands. On its western tip sits Besho, a narrow, man-made stronghold, coconut log bunkers, honeycomb pillboxes, anti-boat obstacles bristling in the lagoon. The Japanese Rear Admiral, Keiji Shibasaki, allegedly bragged that even 1 million attackers could not take this island in a century. The airstrip on Besho made the claim feel credible. Concrete in the center, guns on the flanks, interlocking fire along every probable beach. A fortress no larger than a city park, perfectly designed to kill men in boats. The problem of the modern war. In late 1943, America needed a fast lane into the Central Pacific. The plan, Operation Galvanic, would crack the Gilberts and open the way to the Marshalls and Marianas. The hammer was the U.S. Navy, carriers, battleships, cruisers. The chisel was the 2nd Marine Division, under Major General Julian C. Smith. The question was simple. Could firepower and amphibious tractors, the LVT, Amtrak, beat concrete and reef? Tarawa would decide. Besho's defenses. Besho was engineered to kill from the first 100 yards. The lagoon side, where the beaches looked gentle, was lined with log and concrete bunkers, gun enclosures, and machine gun nests with overlapping arcs. Anti-boat stakes and mined obstacles bit into the shoals. Field pieces and naval guns stood ready to flay landing craft as they slid over the reef. Low, flat ground favored defenders with geometry. A pillbox on the left could sweep a zone that a bunker on the right also owned. The result, death funnels. Any man who paused would be stitched from front and side. The reef, the tide, and the clock. Tarawa's lagoon had a coral reef like a stone dam a few hundred yards from shore. On a favorable tide, shallow draft boats could glide over. On a neap tide, they would hang, helpless, in bullet range. The timetable of naval bombardment, airstrikes, and waves of landing craft assumed water depth that might not arrive. Tarawa made amphibious war a problem of physics. Inches of water became minutes of life. The bombardment. Before dawn, the horizon burned. Battleships and cruisers stitched the island with high explosive arcs. Carrier planes clawed at the bunkers. Sand geysed, palm trunks cartwheeled. Flames licked through the coconut log revetments. From offshore, it looked thorough, like the island had been erased. But low, compact bunkers, dug into coral, anchored under sand, reinforced with timber and concrete, survived. Many weapons were knocked out, many others only waited. The first wave, LVTs versus geometry. H-hour. The LVTs, tracked amphibians, went first. They clattered across the reef, crawled forward like armored beetles, and ground toward red beaches. Marines crouched under spray and tracer fire, feeling the hulls rattle with hits. The tractors could climb obstacles and disgorge men right onto the sand, but as they neared the beach, the defensive geometry revealed itself. Machine guns scissored the waterline. Mortars walked a grid across the tide flats. Splinters scythed into men already soaked and heavy. Some LVTs made it in and punched holes with their own guns. Others burned, black smoke flattening under the Pacific wind. Marines tumbled out and hugged the sand, a strip of world so small it barely separated wet from dry, then crawled toward the seawall, a seawall of logs. Tide-stained, punched by shells, now a line between being targets and being soldiers again. The boats hang up. Behind them, the second wave was disaster. Higgins boats grounded on the reef. Men forced to disembark and wade several hundred yards under fire. Packs ballooned. Water dragged them down. Each figure became a vertical splash surrounded by concentric ripples, perfect aim points. Officers waved men to scatter. Corpsmen pulled the living behind bits of coral. The sea turned opaque with sand and blood. A few volunteer LVT crews fought back and forth like ferries, grabbing clusters of Marines off the reef, shuttling them into the beachhead. They did it with engines whining and armor pinging, over and over, until the tractors were riddled or empty of fuel. At the seawall, at the log seawall, combat compressed. Leadership shrank from battalion to handfuls of men in a crater. Sergeants sketched the next 20 yards in the sand with a knife. Satchel charges and pole charges were passed forward. A flamethrower coughed to life. A bunker was a problem of openings, a slit to blind, a vent to flood with flame, a door to breach after the fire. Each success gained 3 yards and the right to try for 4. Communications were a tangle. Radios got dunked. Runners learned the island by sequence of wrecks, left at the broken tractor. straight past the split palm. Machine gun nests were taken, lost, taken again. Marines learned the sound of an incoming mortar by how an island inhales before it spits. Naval guns on call. As the day wore on, naval gunfire liaison teams made the difference. A few working radios, or semaphore and panels, connected the beachhead to offshore steel. A stubborn bunker would live through a dozen grenades, then die in one salvo from a cruiser that adjusted 200 yards. The sea, in the end, gave the beach its longer arm. Marines learned to time their rushes to the distant thud of a ship's broadside, moving as the enemy flinched at the shockwave. Night on Besho. Night on a flat island erases lines. Flares turned the lagoon into a white ceiling. Shadows became enemies and then only palm trunks again. Japanese counterattacks probed with bayonets and grenades. Marines answered with bars and flares. Then lay flat while mortars felt for them. Sand was the only cover. Men slept an inch below the surface. Faces pressed against the island, learning its salt. Second day, widening the dent. At dawn, the dent in the beachhead became a wedge. Tanks, when they could be floated in or coaxed over the reef, changed the math. Against pillboxes, steel plus flame gave certainty. The assault became methodical: mark, blind, burn, breach, leapfrog to interlock fields of friendly fire instead of enemy fire. Engineers cut lanes through obstacles. Shore parties began dragging in ammunition. A trickle of logistics made the wedge a foothold. On the airfield, corpses lay wind-flattened beside wrecked planes. The runway became both prize and killing zone. Every 10 yards, a new field of fire opened. Every dozen yards a new bunker answered the last. The human arithmetic. Casualties mounted. Men carried back through the same killing water. Wounded stacked behind the same seawall. The arithmetic was brutal but decisive. The defenders could not replace losses, the attackers could. The secret of modern assault is not fearlessness but continuity, that the next wave launches even if the last wave is still in the water. Breaking the spine. By the end of the second day, the interlocking defense began to fail. Each bunker silence loosened the grip of two neighbors. Each lane cleared allowed tanks to nose forward and bring their short-barreled shotguns of shellfire to the next slits. The island was small, but the defenders had planned for the first hour, not the 50th. Once the Marines could turn flanks instead of battering fronts, the geometry belonged to them. The third day, collapse. Morning came with a different sound. Fewer machine guns talking across each other. More single shots, more silence between bursts. Pockets of defenders still fought to the last round, and then with bayonets. But the airfield centerline now split the island, and armored noses pressed to the western tail. By hour 76, organized resistance was finished. The Boast was broken. Aftermath, the count and the lesson. The butcher's bill was terrible. Roughly 1,000 Americans killed and over 2,000 wounded, on the Japanese side. Nearly the entire garrison killed, with only small numbers captured, plus Korean laborers taken prisoner. Numbers alone do not tell Tarawa's truth. The real legacy lay in procedures rewritten. Tide and hydrography, never again assume water depth. Build contingency timetables and bring more LVTs. Fire support integration, put naval guns truly on the net, with reliable shore-to-ship comms and forward observers trained to call steel within yards. Landing sequencing, lead with tracked vehicles, reserve boats risk grounding. Engineer priorities, flamethrowers, satchel charges, pole charges staged forward, obstacle lanes cut early and marked. Medical and evac, pre-planned casualty flow through reef zones, more LVTs held back as ambulance tractors. Public understanding. Tarawa's images, many too raw to show at first, shocked the home front. But they also explained the cost of taking a fortress built on sand. The country learned what island hopping really meant. Why 76 hours mattered. 76 hours did more than win a runway. They taught an institution to learn under fire. Weeks later, those lessons arrived at Kwajalein. Months later, at Saipan and Tinian, where logistics, sequencing, and fire support saved lives that Tarawa had already charged. The Boast was wrong because it imagined numbers without adaptation. Modern war belongs to those who fix the plan on day one and improve it by day two. The last walk. If you walk Besho today, the island still feels too small for the history it holds. The tide rises and falls over coral that once snagged boats and men. Somewhere beneath the sand lie echoes of 1,000 hurried plans and 100 quiet acts of courage. A radio kept dry with a helmet. A runner who knew the island by wrecks. A tractor driver who turned back yet again for strangers waving from a reef. Tarawa was measured in hours, but those hours reshaped a war. Back again, the LVT driver's loop. The Amtrak's engine coughed like an old smoker and then steadied. Corporal Ellis, 21, Louisiana, tapped the fuel gauge and looked over his shoulder. In the cargo well, 6 Marines stared at the waterline where traces stitched tiny incandescent dashes. Back again, the crew chief said. That was the job now, not glory, but loops, reef to beach to reef, on each run, the world narrowed to throttle, wake, and the sound of rounds pinging the hull like hail on tin. They slid across the rough edge of coral. A dead Higgins boat lay on her side, her bow number already half erased by surf. Ellis eased left to use it as a shield for the last 50 yards. They hit sand with a slap. Ramp down, men out, one falls, ankle twisted. Hauled up by a friend. No ceremony, only timing. Reverse. The Amtrak shuddered, turned, and pointed its blunt nose back toward the reef where more figures were waving. Dock, the corpsman's 20 yards. Pharmacist's mate Jameson learned Tarawa by heartbeats. He counted steps, 15 to the wounded man, 5 to roll him into the shallow scrape, 10 to cut the pack and find the bleeding. Talk to me, he said, not because talk mattered, but because a human voice could fence out the noise for 10 seconds. The tourniquet went on, the morphine siret snapped, the tag tied to a buttonhole in fat block letters. When the mortar came in close, Jameson lay over the patient and felt sand patter his neck like hot rain. Still here, he said when it passed. It was as much a promise to himself as to the Marine. Inside the bunker, a Japanese corporal's view. In the log and concrete chamber, the air was sweet with the rot of wet coconut fiber and the metallic breath of cordite. Corporal Nakamura had rehearsed this fight for months. Fields of fire were memorized, traversing limits chalked on the cradle of the Nambu machine gun. The first waves were a diagram from the training manual, until the tractors climbed the reef. That was not on the diagram. Their pace felt wrong, slow but relentless, like a tide with teeth. When the flamethrower touched the vent for the first time, smoke folded the bunker in half. Voices, his and his crew's, became small. He worked the gun by feel. The sight picture was no longer horizon and wave, it was the slit of daylight that meant survival. The shore-to-ship conversation. Lieutenant Parker's SCR radio had the temperament of a mule, but when it worked, the Pacific itself seemed to lean in. On me, grid 3-1 from the split palm. 200 right, 100 short, he said. The spotter up on the hulk of a wrecked barge flagged the burst with a panel. The cruiser's next salvo came like a door slamming on God's house, a coherent pressure that pushed the breath out of your chest. The bunker's roof lifted, sagged, and then the flamethrower team walked the gout of fire across the broken mouth. The conversation with the ship was not eloquent. It did not need to be. It was a language of small corrections and large consequences. Tank infantry team, improvised. When a Sherman finally clawed its way over, the Marines treated it like rain in a drought. Stay on our left. A sergeant slapped the glacis and made a circle with his finger for the turret. The tank's commander, head and shoulders out, goggles milked with salt, thumbed the cokes and cut a slit of sand into spray. A satchel charge carrier crouched behind the left track, counting the tank's rhythm. Move. Halt. Fire. Move. Halt. Fire. At the next bunker, the Sherman 75 barked point blank. It was a shotgun blast made of steel. The infantry went in behind the concussion like a second wave inside the first. The reef crossing, memory by memory. Decades later, veterans would describe the wade in small, exact things. The weight of a cartridge belt when it filled. The way a helmet strung on a strap beat a man's back like a hand urging him down. How the lagoon's water tasted different where blood mixed in. The copper edge on salt. Some remembered strangers' faces better than friends. A man seen only once. Mouth open in surprise, falling without sound. The reef did not stay on Tarawa. For many it came home in dreams and lived there. A long shoal with no end. Engineers' grammar. Blind. Burn. Breach. The new language spread like a rumor that saved lives. Blind. Smoke or dust or a direct hit on the slit. Burn. The long tongue of the M2. Fed with gasoline thickened to cling. Breach. Charges on the doorframe. Poles to push satchels into vents. A short, brutal lesson in overpressure. Each team learned its part in yards, not doctrine. The best teams wrote the island in verbs. Mark. Mask. Move. Make it quiet. Air overhead. No easy friend. Carrier fighters and bombers came low. Fast. And brave. But a flat island gives few landmarks. And smoke turned everything into the same shade of grey. A panel on the beach meant friend. Unless it was covered by a body or singed to ash. Pilots strained for the line where, close, became too close. The ground learned to trust the ships more than the planes for bunker work. The planes learned to hunt movement beyond the runway. Strafing counterattacks threading through scrub. The difference, ultimately, was timing. Steel from the sea was a hammer. Air was a chisel that had to strike the mortar. Not the brick. Blue on blue, preventing the worst. On a square mile of chaos, prevention was a million small courtesies, a strip of colored cloth around a helmet, a shouted password that changed at dusk, a habit of raising weapon muzzles a hand's breadth when a shape loomed too close. A Marine private remembered the quietest order he ever heard: check before you save us. He did, one extra heartbeat before firing. A friend lived because of it. Beachmasters and the first supply lane. The Beachmaster's whistle outsliced the gunfire. Left lane for ammo, right for bodies, he barked, words as cold as an invoice because anything warmer would fail. Shore party men, some barely armed, built a port out of wrecks, ropes, and will. They stacked crates behind driftwood, sandbagged a corner for morphine and whole blood, painted arrows on planks. A single LVT, miraculously intact, was assigned to water cans for 6 hours. And in that time prevented a dozen heat strokes from becoming deaths. Logistics had a face, chapped lips, a pencil behind one ear, and a voice gone hoarse from arranging hope. The casualty chain: lagoon, sand, ship. Stretcher bearers learned to step together so the pain would synchronize. The wounded could brace if they knew when the hurt would arrive. At the reef line, they waited for a tractor or, lacking that, built a living raft of men around the stretcher to float it in. On the transport offshore, a surgical team ran a war in miniature: ether, clamps, sutures, a rhythm as relentless as the one on the beach, but measured in breaths regained. Cameras, sensors, and home. Tarawa was photographed without makeup. The raw film came home and cut Americans to the bone. Some images never made broadcast, others did, and they changed the shape of public comprehension. Letters followed. Mothers writing to Marine headquarters asking if a blurred figure might be their boy. A pastor asking permission to print a still in the church bulletin, so people will understand what they pray for. The senses learned compassion could be served by truth with care. Flintlock, the test of lessons. At Kwajalein weeks later, the reef's riddle met an answer: more LVTs, better hydrographic scouts, adjusted timetables that waited for water instead of pretending it was there. Surefire control teams were knitted into the first waves. Engineers carried the right tools forward instead of discovering needs in front of a locked door. Losses did not vanish. War does not offer that bargain, but the curve bent. Tarawa's tuition had been paid. Flintlock spent the knowledge wisely. Myth and misunderstanding. Was the Admiral's boast exactly as quoted? Historians debate. Words grow teeth in retelling. Did the Navy cut the bombardment too short? Many Marines thought so. Others note that coral bunkers are hard to murder from distance. Was the neap tide predictable? Better charts might have warned. But local water keeps private habits. The truth inside the myths is simpler. Hubris kills planning, reef kills assumptions. What if, without the tractors? Counterfactuals are only useful when they teach respect. Without LVTs, the Wade would have drowned a battalion's worth of men before noon. Without naval guns tied tight to beach radios, the bunker belt might have lived to nightfall with teeth enough to bite again. Without engineers, every bunker is a tomb for the living. The lesson is not romance for hardware but humility before systems. The missing and the return. Long after flags were folded, teams returned to Besho to find and bring home those who never left. Sand does not easily surrender names, it keeps them in careful little boxes of chemistry and time. Families waited through seasons of not knowing. Then a call: we found him. A jawline matched, a wedding ring etched with initials, a DNA whisper braided from nieces and nephews. Tarawa gave back what it could, and for some, the war ended in a newly cut piece of earth close to home. A post-war Japanese view. In post-war interviews, Japanese officers spoke with the double vision of pride and grief. The defenses worked until they didn't. The plan counted on reef. On tide, on killing the first hour and letting confusion do the rest. It nearly succeeded. What undid it was not only Allied material, they said, but iteration, the enemy who learned as quickly as he bled. Some veterans left incense on Besho and spoke a prayer for all dead. Not just their own, the island made that prayer feel honest. The principles, distilled. Hydrography is destiny, measure water like ammunition. Fire support lives in networks, not calibers. Radios beat guns until guns are on the net. Engineers are assault infantry with different tools. Put them first in the plan, not last in the line. Logistics is the fourth element of firepower. A thirsty rifle is a quiet rifle. Continuity wins. Waves that launch on time bend battles. Epilogue, a small island and an immense change. Besho is still a crescent of sand, still ringed by reef that turns surf into lace. The difference is invisible, a doctrine carved into the marrow of a generation. On maps, Tarawa is a dot, in the chain of cause and effect. It is a hinge. 76 hours cannot carry 1,000,000 men across a century. They can do something more useful, teach an army and a navy how to arrive. Hydrographers and the secret of inches. Long before the first LVT's track kissed coral, a different kind of scout had been at work. Hydrographers sketched the lagoon with lead lines and cautious boats, chasing a geometry that changed with the moon. Their notebooks were filled with numbers that looked small, 31 inches here, 28 there, yet each digit meant life or drowning for men in steel and canvas. They argued for wider windows. Later H-hours, more tractors. The sea was not stubborn, it was particular. And it punished imprecision the way a bank punishes arithmetic errors. At Tarawa, inches became history. Chaplain and the quiet inventory. On the transport ship, a chaplain kept a ledger no quartermaster would recognize, a list of names to visit. Letters to promise, a tally of hands held. He memorized faces in the flicker of red lamps and learned the sounds of men who did not want prayers but did want company. When the wounded came up from the OR, he did small things, water to lips, a joke from home, the careful folding of a blood-stained photograph. War often counts by tons, the chaplain counted by breaths. Night counterattack on the airstrip. It came just after midnight, a string of figures low against the runway, zigzagging between wrecks, grenades clinking like loose coins in a pocket. Marines at the dug-in line along the tarmac felt the air pressure change just before the first grenade thunked into the sand. Flares popped and swayed, turning the world into a theater of flat shadows. Fire was short, fast, disciplined, garand, then silence, a lean into the dark, then another burst. The attack died in stutters, leaving behind the crackle of small fires and the dry ticking of cooling metal. The runway remained a line of decision, neither fully owned nor fully denied. But that night it bowed toward the Marines. The command tent, decisions measured in maps. Inside a canvas tent held down by sandbags, maps grew fingerprints and coffee rings. Major General Julian Smith listened as regimental commanders sketched arrows with pencils bitten flat. The language of the room was a modest sort of confidence, no bravado. Only muster next. Radio fragments came and went like surf. Tank immobilized. Engineer gap open. Counterattack forming. The decision to shift a battalion 20 degrees on a flat island felt like turning a ship in a narrow channel. Every correction bought time, every delay bought casualties. The tent grew quieter as dawn bled into the canvas. Seabees ashore, making a port from ruins. When the Seabees clambered through the surf, they brought a second war, the fight to make order out of debris. They looted the island for materials with a pirate's eye, rails for sleds, timbers for cranes, a door for a table where a map could lie flat. A section chief drew a rectangle in the sand and labeled it harbor. Then made it real with ropes, hands, and a salvaged winch. In a morning, they taught the island to receive water, ammo, litters, hope. It is hard to defend a beach that has become a workplace. The prisoners and the language of surrender. Few surrendered at Besho, and those who did arrived as if surprised to find themselves still breathing. Marines learned the gestures as they went, open hands high, weapons pushed away with boots. Water given before questions. Interpreters turned fear into sentences and, sometimes, maps into hints. A captured Korean laborer showed a shovel-blunted finger toward a vent, an hour later. Smoke climbed from that hole and never returned. War compresses the distance between enemy and informant to the width of a drink of water. The moment the island tilted. There is a moment in certain battles when the ground itself seems to tilt, the geometry of fire flips. And the defenders' interlock becomes the attackers. At Tarawa, the tilt was not a trumpet blast but a quiet accumulation, 3 pillboxes in 1 hour. A tank kept running with cannibalized track pins. An LVT used as a moving wall for 30 yards of runway. The map in the command tent did not leap, it settled. And everyone in the room felt it in the way they exhaled. The after-action mindset. After the shooting stopped, the professionals sharpened their pencils. What failed? What worked because luck wore a friendly face? The list was not a lament but a contract with the next beach. Radios must be waterproofed as if they were swimmers. Not tourists. LVT availability is a line item as sacred as ammunition. Forward observers need better training in coral geometry. Medical evacuation requires its own plan. Not borrowed minutes from logistics. These notes became paragraphs, then checklists, then drills. Doctrine is archaeology done in the present tense. The long ripple, from Besho to Saipan. Months later, over the sands of Saipan and Tinian, crews and commanders could feel Tarawa in their bones. LVT trains moved like subways on schedules. Surefire control talked to ships as if they shared a bench. Engineers arrived with the exact tool for the exact door. Casualties still came. War is a creditor who never forgives the principal, but the interest rate fell. The ripple from Besho reached across an ocean of small decisions. Memory, memorial, and the work of returning. On anniversaries, the island wears flowers, garlands at simple stones. Flags that snap in a wind that smells of salt and sun-warmed diesel. Divers trace the lagoon's relics, families read names, veterans touch the seawall as if greeting an old, complicated friend. Recovery teams continue a labor of love and science, returning identities to bones the sea held close. The work says something the battle could not, that the meaning of a place grows as the noise fades. A glossary learned in sand. Seawall, the log and sand barrier that divided survival from maneuver. Neap tide, a gentle moon that proved merciless to boats. LVT, amphibious tractor, at Tarawa. Lifeboat, battering ram, and ambulance. SCR radio, the fragile voice that could turn a cruiser's gun into a scalpel. Blind burn breach, engineer's liturgy for killing bunkers. Tilt, the unrecorded instant when an island gives up its geometry. Coda, what the reef taught. Tarawa's reef taught a generation the cost of assumptions and the virtue of iteration. It insisted that planning respect physics, that compassion find logistics, that courage show up again after courage has failed once already. The boast of 100 years collapsed not under a single blow, but under thousands of small, correct ones. That is how you cross oceans, that is how you shorten wars. Sand, heat, and the discipline of water. Tarawa's sand was an enemy with a billion teeth. It crawled into receivers, chewed firing pins, turned grease into paste. Heat rose off the runway in a mirage that made distances lie. Leaders learned to ration ounces, a helmet half full for a squad, a canteen passed with the lid kept on to save spill. Water discipline wasn't a slogan, it was a way to keep rifles talking and minds clear when the island felt like the inside of an oven. Smoke, drawing with the wind. On a flat island, smoke became a pencil and the wind the artist's hand. Engineers popped canisters to veil a crossing. Mortarmen walked a grey curtain in 25-yard steps. Sometimes it betrayed them, gusts tore gaps that framed Marines like silhouettes, but when it held, smoke erased the defender's geometry. An NCO kept a diary of where smoke flowed best, annotating the map with small arrows. Good drift, eddies here, no cover afternoon. Snipers and the lesson of patience. A single rifle in a palm crown can halt a platoon. Tarawa taught patience that killed. Freeze, watch, find the thread of heat that separates a man from a tree. A pair, spotter and shooter, worked in whispers, then waited for the breath between two bursts of machine gun fire to take a quiet shot. The best sniper stories on Besho are short because the work, when done well, is invisible. Radios and redundancy. If a radio worked, battles bent. If it drowned, battles stalled. Units carried redundancy like treasure, 2 sets for the surefire control team. Hand flags in a waterproof bag. Prearranged panels to mark friendly lines. A corporal, promoted to radioman by bad luck, learned to pack the set like a newborn, high on the back. Wrapped against salt, antenna clipped before surf. The new doctrine was simple. One message must have 3 roads. Japanese doctrine on a coral island. Besho's plan reflected a doctrine sharpened in China and refined on paper. Slow the landing in the lagoon. Split the waves with fire. Counterattack before the attackers organized. It nearly worked. The coral bunkers owned the first hour, but the doctrine presumed confusion would do the rest. Tarawa taught the defenders a grim counter lesson. An enemy who restores order under fire can steal the plan by its second day. Corps of Engineers, turning airfield to asset. As soon as the runway stopped being a killing zone, bulldozers snorted to life. Teams filled craters with coral, rolled it flat with improvised drums, and painted a centerline with fuel-soaked rags that smoked in the sun. In days, scouts and liaison planes could hop in and out, shrinking the Pacific a little. The fastest way to make an island safe is to make it useful. Medical echelons, from tourniquet to ether. Tarawa's medicine ran on layers. Aidmen controlled bleeding and pain. Beach clearing stations kept airways open and notes legible. Transports offshore became bright. Hard rooms of steel, light, and ether. Surgeons spoke a calm language that made time expand. Suction, clamp, suture, while the ship rolled. A lieutenant later wrote that the first full breath he heard after a chest wound repair sounded like a small orchestra tuning to life. Combat artists and correspondents. Some arrived with sketchbooks, others with cameras, all with the same question: how to tell what this felt like. A combat artist drew the seawall with charcoal, smudging with a thumb until the line between wet and dry became a bruise across the page. A correspondent typed standing up on a crate, sand in the keys, trying to find a balance between the shock of truth and the dignity of the men who had to go back tomorrow. Graves registration and the care of names. When the gun lines moved forward, another line formed behind, graves registration. They logged, wrapped, marked, and prayed in their own quiet ways. Crosses and stars grew in neat ranks within a geometry kinder than the one the enemy had designed. A sergeant said the hardest part was spelling. Getting each letter right so a mother would not feel her son misremembered twice. Civilians, displacement, and return. The atoll's people had lived with tides as clocks long before armies arrived. War moved them like weather, evacuations ahead of battle, ration lines after. When the airstrip hummed again, so did small civil rhythms, water collection, copra drying, rebuilt paths. Military histories often look past civilians, the island never did. The briefing that changed briefings. Back in rear areas, a new kind of briefing took shape. Tide charts first, reef second, enemy third. Planners stacked contingencies like sandbags. They rehearsed the language of corrections. If LVT availability drops below X, switch to plan Delta. If wind above Y, smoke shifts to route B. The briefings got shorter and smarter, fewer adjectives, more checklists. What endures? Tarawa endures as a small place that changed big habits. It survives in the way an engineer loads a boat, in the way a young officer reads a map for wind and water first, in the way a radio is kept dry like a life. The Boast of 100 years collapsed because 1,000 people, for 3 days, did their work a little better each hour. That is history's quietest miracle.